Welcome to the deep dive. You know, if you've ever looked at a modern pedal board and wondered where that really warm, almost murky analog delay sound started, well, you often land on one specific green box, the MXR MX118 analog delay. So today, we're diving into this vintage giant. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding its history, its unique design, that signature sound, and why it still matters.
Yeah, it first showed up around 1976. It was MXR's main analog delay in their reference series. They kept making it right up until the original company shut down in '84. It really defined a certain delay sound for that era.
And the first thing you notice is just how big it is. I mean, MXR was famous for pedals like the Phase 90, the distortion plus small standard boxes. But the MX118 is this huge thing, affectionately called the big green box.
Right.
And apparently that large format actually set the template for their other big pedals later on, like the flanger and stereo chorus.
Interesting. It really did. And that size wasn't just for looks.
Okay, so let's talk about that design. Visually, it's iconic, right? That dark green enclosure takes up a lot of space.
It absolutely had to be that size. Unlike simpler effects, say a phaser, which might run off a 9-volt. An analog delay back then needed way more internal circuitry. You've got delay lines, the BBD chips we'll get into, the power supply components. It just demanded more real estate and, crucially, more power.
Makes sense. But the controls themselves are pretty straightforward MXR style.
Oh, yeah, super simple. You've got delay time, mix for wet-dry blend, and region, which is just feedback for repeats. Very intuitive.
But the connections and the power, that's where it gets interesting compared to today's gear.
Definitely. It has 3 jacks, input, standard output with a mix, and then this really crucial separate wet-only output.
A wet-only output back in '76 on a stomp box. That feels pretty advanced for the time. How would you use that?
It was a serious pro feature. It let you do advanced routing, maybe send just the wet signal to other effects, or more commonly run wet-dry stereo rigs. You send your dry guitar sound to one amp and the 100% delayed signal to another. Creates this huge stereo image you just couldn't get otherwise. That tells you it wasn't, just a basic pedal.
And then there's the power situation.
Yes. That's probably the biggest hurdle for using one today. It's mains-powered AC. Vintage ones literally have a built-in power cord you plug into the wall, 120 volts or whatever was standard regionally.
No standard DC jack like everything else on a modern board.
Exactly. You can't just daisy chain it. It needs its own power solution or modification. That AC cord really signals how much juice those old circuits needed.
Okay, so let's get into that tech. What's making that sound and needing all that power? It's built around BBDs, right? Bucket Brigade devices. Can you unpack what that actually means?
Sure. BBDs are the core of analog delay. Think of it like a microscopic line of capacitors, like tiny buckets. The audio signal gets sampled, turned into little packets of charge, and then passed down the line from bucket to bucket, timed by a clock signal. The number of buckets and the clock speed set your delay time. It's basically an analog version of a shift register.
And the specific chips MXR used, the Redicon ones, are key to the MX118's whole vibe.
Absolutely key. These Redicon chips are totally obsolete now, and collectors go nuts for them. The very first MX118s actually used 3 separate Redicon SAD124 chips. Each one had 512 stages, or buckets. They chained them together to get the maximum delay time.
3 chips just for one delay pedal. Wow.
Yeah. Later on, they managed to refine the design to use a single, more complex Redicon R5101 chip.
Okay, so moving from 3 chips down to 1, does that change the sound much between those versions?
It can, but it's subtle. The R5101 version might sound a tiny bit cleaner, maybe eke out a fraction more delay time just because the clocking is more unified. But fundamentally, both versions share the same BBD limitations. And honestly, those limitations are what create the magic, the sound people want.
Right, because that whole BBD process limits the maximum delay time, doesn't it? We're talking, 300 milliseconds maybe?
Yeah, generally around 300 millismax. Which, compared to a modern digital delay that can go for seconds, is like nothing.
So if you only have 300 milliseconds, how does that change how you'd actually use the pedal?
Well, you stop thinking about super long ambient washes or complex rhythmic stuff. It's not for that. You focus entirely on the texture and the character of the repeats. The sound quality becomes everything. And that quality comes directly from how BBDs work and the compromises needed.
Okay, explain that compromise. Why does it get that murky sound?
It's down to the physics and the engineering. BBDs sample the audio using that clock signal, right? That process creates high-frequency noise, clock noise, aliasing, stuff you don't want. So to get rid of it, the circuit has to filter the signal pretty heavily, both going in and coming out. And that filtering inevitably shaves off the high frequencies from the audio signal itself. So each time the signal repeats, it goes through that filtering again, losing more highs. The repeats degrade, they get darker, warmer, less distinct.
And that degradation, that roll-off of the high end, that's the signature MX 118 sound, that thick, almost syrupy quality.
Exactly. That's what people mean when they say it sounds warm, saturated, vintage, organic. It's a very viscous sound, much darker and thicker than cleaner analog delays or certainly digital ones. It adds this depth, this atmosphere. A lot of players find that irreplaceable, especially for stuff like shoegaze or ambient, where texture is king.
But, okay, for collectors or anyone trying to buy one now, it gets even trickier because it wasn't just one single MX 118 model, right? There were variations.
Yeah, this is where you need to pay attention. There are at least 3 main vintage versions we know about. They mostly differ based on the chip's inside and the outputs. Version 1 used those 3 SAD1024 chips chained together, and it only had a single mono output jack.
Okay, simple enough.
Then version 2 switched to that single R5101 chip, and crucially, it added the dual outputs, the standard mix, and that separate wet-only jack we talked about.
Got it. And version 3?
Version 3 was basically the same internally as version 2, using the R5101 and dual outputs, but it finally added an LED status indicator.
Ah, the LED, which highlights a major quirk of the first 2 versions.
Exactly. If you have one of those earlier ones, which is pretty common on the vintage market, there's no light to tell you if the pedal is on or off. You literally have to tell by listening or maybe seeing if your amp's sound changes. It's kind of wild by today's standards.
And that lack of an LED plus the AC power, it points to bigger issues when you try to use one on a modern pedal board, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The problems go beyond just convenience. It raises serious questions about bypass quality. These old units, especially the early ones, didn't have anything like modern, true bypass switching.
So what happens when it's switched off?
Well, users consistently report issues, things like a noticeable drop in volume when bypassed, or a change in your core guitar tone suck, they call it. Or sometimes you even get signal bleed, where you can faintly hear the delay effect even when it's supposed to be completely off.
Add to that the fact these are, 40, 50-year-old analog circuits?
Yeah.
Component drift must be a huge factor, too.
It really is. Capacitors age, resistors drift, and especially the bias voltage for those sensitive BBD chips can wander off spec. If the bias isn't right, the sound quality tanks, or it might just stop delaying altogether. They need maintenance, calibration. It's not like a modern digital pedal you just set and forget.
Right, so keeping one running is almost a commitment in itself.
Pretty much. A dedicated hobby, not just plug and play.
But despite all that, the size, the short delay time, the power issues, the bypass quirks, the MX 118 is still revered. People talk about it as the forerunner, like the father of MXR's modern analog delays.
Yeah, things like the carbon copy owe a huge debt to the 118.
Its legacy seems totally tied to that unique sound character.
Completely. You see it used in genres where that thick, saturated, slightly degraded texture is actually a feature, not a bug. Shoegaze, ambient, drone. Artists use it because of its limitations, not in spite of them. They're chasing that specific warm, murky, viscous thing that proves its value.
And since MXR never did a proper big box reissue, finding a vintage one is the only way to get that exact sound, which means modifications are often essential to make them usable today.
Exactly. And this leads to the world of mods and repairs. Specialists, like the folks at Stompbox Electronics who've documented this stuff really well, offer specific upgrades.
What are the common mods?
Well, the most requested is usually this true bypass conversion, often combined with adding an LED that solves the volume drop, the tone suck, the signal bleed, and gives you that visual on-off indicator. Kills several birds with one stone.
Okay, that makes sense. But the really big one must be tackling the power situation, getting rid of that AC cord.
That's the other major one. The Synergy mod, or DC power conversion. This involves carefully modifying the internal power circuitry so the pedal can run off a standard modern DC power supply like everything else on your board.
Which probably helps with noise too.
Hugely. Running that AC power alongside sensitive DC pedals can often introduce ground loops and hum. Converting it to DC helps integrate it much more cleanly.
But performing these mods isn't just a standard procedure, is it? There's a catch.
There is. And it's fascinating. Because of those different versions we talked about, a good tech has to basically play detective first. They need to open it up and accurately figure out which BBD chip configuration is inside the 3 SAD1024s or the single R5101.
Why does that matter for the mod?
because the circuit board layouts and the wiring needed for true bypass or the DC power conversion are slightly different depending on which revision it is. You can't just follow one set of instructions. You have to tailor the mod to the specific vintage guts you're working with. It requires real expertise.
So that brings us to the end of our deep dive here. The MX118, it really feels like this pivotal, complex piece of effects history. Revolutionary for its time, huge power demands, massive footprint, creating this really loved, dark, almost gooey delay tone. But yeah, it requires serious effort, modification, and ongoing care to keep it working in a modern setup.
Absolutely. And if you zoom out, the MX118 is kind of the perfect example of that constant tension in audio gear, isn't it? It's the unique, desirable sound of vintage technology, that specific, degrading echo rubbing up against the absolute necessity of modern convenience, like clean power and reliable bypass.
So here's something for you to think about. Considering the effort, the diagnosis needed, the cost to find one, maintain it, get it professionally modded, does that distinct, warm, murky character the big green MX118 offers still provide something truly irreplaceable? Something that even the best, cleanest modern analog delays just can't quite capture? Something to mull over.